Hey you guys, this is a really useful short game that I want to share with you. It's not a game that I played, this is actually one of my students who played this. He sent me the game and said check this one out, I think you might appreciate it. So let's go with that. So it's a 15-minute rapid game. Both players are rated between 950 and 1000, so this will be really instructive for a lot of people. Now, so my student's playing with it with the black pieces, and he plays the Piet's defense. But what I want you to look at, if you're a sub 1000 player, even sub 1200, right? I want you to watch as we go through this. For every move, I'd like you to just keep pausing and think, okay, what would I play here? What would I play here? And then see the moves that black plays. And what we're looking for is moves that gain space, take the initiative, right? Put pressure on the opponent. And there's always choices in chess, right? Now, I think this is a really good example of keeping up the pressure and keeping the initiative. So let's just dive straight in. So white opens with e4, and now we have d6. This is the Piet's defense, and it could lead to, knight out with lion or Hannum variations. But this is the one that he plays as black. So white plays d4, grabbing the center, makes perfect sense. And now we have knight to f6. So the issue with the Piets is that basically what you're wanting to play is like a King's Indian setup as black. Okay, so you want to play like g6, bishop to g7, fianchetto the bishop, and then castle kingside. Right now, the problem with that is that with the classic King's Indian, you would want to develop your knight first, okay? But when there's a pawn here on e4, you can't put your knight here because the pawn will just come forward and hit your knight and you'll lose a tempo. And particularly as black, you really, really don't want that. So the move d6 is played first in order to prevent e5. Okay, so we have d4, knight comes out, knight to c3, and now g6. Okay, now the pawn does advance, but this is all right because d takes e5, d takes e5, and now we have an exchange of queens. And I think this is one of those cases where it's useful to do. Now, the queen is actually defended by another piece, in this case, the knight on c3. Okay, now if the queen wasn't defended by another piece, and sometimes you might, of course, have a bishop here defending the queen as well, then you would force the king to move, because queen takes queen, there's no other legal move the king has to take, lose castling rights, and that means that the king's going to struggle to castle, and it also means that at least one of the rooks is going to have a hard time getting involved in the game. But in this case, of course, the queen is defended by the knight. However, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, means that white has essentially undeveloped his knight. So his knight's come up here, onto the third rank, and then captured here again, going back to the first rank. Okay, so who has the initiative right now? I would say black does. Okay, now clearly the pawn is attacking the knight, so the knight now moves. But the knight moves, I mean, the knight had options, right? It's moved to a square where it's attacking the pawn again. Okay, so this is forcing white to respond. White develops knight to f3, defending the pawn. Now we have bishop to g7, and what does this mean? Two attackers and only one defender right now. Okay, so the pawn is now vulnerable again. So now we have bishop to e2. So common error that beginners will make, failing to simply count attackers and defenders. Two attackers, only one defender. Black can capture the pawn for free. Knight captures, bishop captures. Okay, so now black is a pawn up and ready to castle. White now develops his knight back out. So this knight has now played 3 moves. 1, 2, 3. Okay, Jag doesn't like that. The cockerel doesn't like that idea. Okay, so knight out again. Castles and castles. Now c3 comes. And I guess maybe it's defending this pawn here, but the pawn is actually defended. Maybe it's pushing this so that the dark squared bishop can develop, right? But it doesn't really aid development directly. Now black plays bishop back to g7. This is, I would say, maybe a questionable move because this bishop isn't threatened right now. Yeah, it's attacking this pawn on h2. It's in the middle of the board. It's not, and it's got plenty of options of places it can go. Right, so this bishop isn't under threat. I would have said maybe a developing move, bring the light squared bishop out, get ready to put one of the rooks onto the open file, would probably have been more accurate at this point, but hey, bishop back to g7, it stays there in its little sniper's nest, waiting for an opportunity. And now we have another move with this bishop. Okay, so this bishop's now moved twice, and it's kind of threatening this knight here. So what would you play in this position? Okay, so what we have here is knight to e5. This bishop is defending this pawn. The knight is now attacking the bishop, and the only defender of the bishop is the pawn on g2. So if we have knight takes and then pawn takes, that's not leaving the king in a very comfortable position. Okay, so you can see again, this is front foot play. We are taking the game to our opponent, making our opponent respond over and over again. So the bishop has to move, and this bishop has now moved loads. And now f5 hits the bishop again. So now what does the bishop do? Comes back with check. Okay, now, what would you play here? I think a lot of beginners would simply play king to h8 and get out of the way of the bishop. Right? Black here plays e6. Nice, elegant little move. Okay, the pawn again is defended by this bishop. The light square bishop is doing an important job there, even though it hasn't developed into the board. Right, and now look at this again. This bishop is now having to move for at least, this is the 5th time this single piece has moved. Okay, so the bishop now comes back to b3, where it's still in line with the king and still pinning this pawn. So we have to remember that. Now b6. This is preparing possibly to fianchetto this bishop on b7, or maybe put it on a6, where it would be attacking this rook. And the knight moves again. So it's kind of it's attacking the e5 knight. The e5 knight is defended, so that's okay. So what would you play here? The move black plays. This is a really good move. Okay. It's better than it even seems at first. So, bishop to a6. Now what this means is two things. This knight has put itself in a position where it is pinnable against the rook. Okay. What's more, so we can't have, for example, knight takes knight. If knight takes knight, bishop takes rook. Then this knight now on e5, the white knight can't capture anything else from there that's important. Okay, so let's say king takes bishop, bishop takes knight, and white is down the exchange. White's already down a pawn. Okay. Also, let's say the rook moves or something else. We have two attackers on the knight, and it only has one defender. So what does white play? Moves the rook out of the way, and we grab a piece for free. Now, what should white do here? Okay, so we have an exchange of material. Now, when you're down a full piece, exchanging pieces doesn't make sense, right? You shouldn't go into equal exchanges in a situation like that. Maybe you could argue that because of these light squared pawns around the king, that this bishop, being a light squared bishop, is going to have less scope, less attacking scope in the game than this knight. You might argue that, but even so, I think this bishop would be quite happy somewhere like here, you know, attacking the rook, defending the king. You do want to keep as many tools in your toolbox as possible, so I don't really approve of that move as such. Okay, so now white is up a full piece and a pawn. So what would you play in this position? Okay, finally the dark squared bishop has developed and goes into g5. Maybe it's got ideas of coming here and attacking the rook, but that would be just a prod. That's not really an attack. Okay, so we have a5 now from black. That might be discouraging the pawn push on that side, not sure. Rook now comes back. It's not really attacking the bishop there, because it would just lose further material. It might be attacking this one. Okay, so how would you resolve this tension here? Black plays c5. So you can see pawn push, pawn push, pawn push. Each of these pushes is gaining space. What that means is that, look at the number of squares, right, that that black is now controlling in his opponent's side of the board. Okay, that's what's meant by space. Okay, so that bishop's looking there as well. White is also controlling a few squares on black's side of the board as well, which is not bad, but significantly down in material. And now we have another move. So the rook moves again. It's attacking that pawn which is defended by the rook, and it's also attacking this pawn. Okay, so what would you do to keep the initiative, to keep the forward momentum? b5 pushes forward again, where the pawn is now defending the bishop and the bishop is defending the pawn. Now we have a4, and instead of having to respond to this, because black doesn't have to respond, if the pawn takes, bishop takes back. Okay, counterattack. You're attacking my pawn, fine, I'm going to attack your bishop. Pawn's defended by this bishop, and again it's forcing white to take a step backwards almost. So the bishop comes in attacking the rook, that's not a problem. Counterattack. Okay, this is a very weak attack. So now the rook comes here, now it's attacking the bishop, and the bishop's not defended, the bishop's got to do something. Bishop back to here, what would you play? g5. Okay, so now you can see these pawns are gradually starting to migrate from the light squares to the dark squares, and this is a really good thing, because pawns on the dark squares are going to make life difficult for the dark squared bishop, because if they create a barrier, then the dark squared bishop cannot get through that barrier. But there's a more significant threat here. If you look at this now, and it's because we have the f5 push earlier on. Remember, that was a nice aggressive push, gaining space, cramping the opponent, clamping down on their position. Right, where's this bishop got to go? g3. And the next move should be pretty obvious. f4 traps the bishop, and it's good night, white. Okay, white here resigns the game with 10 minutes left on the clock. So I would say that is a really, really solid, particularly for a player under 1,000, very solid play. But what really impresses me with that game is that front foot attitude throughout. Each of those moves, when there's a choice of moves, when you've got an option to kind of retreat or just, solidify, black in so many instances found a move that was pushing the pawns up the board, attacking pieces, making white respond. I mean, white really never actually got much of a chance to try anything in this game, because he was constantly fending off black's just little tactical moves. These punches kept coming, and white was like that for most of the game. Yes, white tried a few things, but in the end just never landed a punch on black really in that game. So awesome game, well done to black, and I hope it's been useful for you in your play. So the takeaway from this is that you've always got options in chess, and when you've got those choices, try and find the moves that just push against your opponent, right? Keep the punches coming in, make them respond, make them react, make them keep stepping back towards the ropes, and your chess will certainly improve. Okay, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting Chess Bootcamp. Please do subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed. I'll see you soon.